We only have a couple of months before Halo Infinite finally comes out, and because of this impending game release, Luke and I decided that we need to definitely 100% Halo the Master Chief Collection before the game comes out, which means we have like 150 to 200 more achievements we still have to do. But since November seemed so close, we called up our contacts over at 343 and had them delay the game just so we had time to get all the achievements. And while we'll have to focus on those lasso achievements we haven't yet done yet sometime soon, there was one other in particular achievement that really stood out to us because not only is this achievement one of the hardest achievements in the Master Chief Collection, but if we are in fact going to go for the full 100% of the MCC, we're going to have to get past this one way or another. And that of course is the Monopolized Achievement, which essentially is you must complete Halo 2 on Legendary difficulty in under 3 hours. And while on the surface it might not sound like a very difficult achievement, when you start to look into Halo 2 and Legendary difficulty, it starts to become apparent that this isn't just a regular faster playthrough we're going to have to do. This ended up becoming a mission to turn Luke and I into Legendary Speedrunners if we were going to get this achievement. Sure, while there's other achievements in the MCC that are challenging when you look at their under 3 hour speedruns, nothing compares to Halo 2, as with Halo 2 not only are there 13 full campaign levels you have to play through versus the typical 9 to 10 that you would see in the other Halo games, Halo 2 Legendary also has this interesting feature, if you want to call it that, where essentially the Iron Skull, as you would know it in all the other Halo games, is always enabled on Legendary difficulty, which means if one person dies, we're both dead and we have to go back to the last checkpoint. And of course Halo 2 also is known for having some of the more challenging Legendary difficulties amongst Halo games and longer levels in some cases than other Halo games. So when you take the 13 levels and the 180 minutes you have, we did the math that we have just under 14 minutes on average per level if we were going to pull off this achievement. So overall, our main strategy was to first play through most of the levels on Legendary difficulty to try to get some sort of a feel of what we would be having to do along the way, maybe look up some great strategies online by people like Naked Eli or the Halo Completionist, and then put our big brains together and try to come up with a strategy that works for us, because we're not really the best Halo players, we're typically just really patient Halo players, and that's how we get through a lot of the challenges that we do. But this is something different. This is something that actually involves a bit of skill, and we were going to have to learn quite a bit along the way. Now, first off, when we were logging our initial times, we typically went somewhat out of order, just skipping the levels we really didn't want to play, and maybe practiced the levels that we did enjoy a little bit more than others. We decided that as a start, it would be good to run each level once, and we added up all of our times, and we were already sitting well over 6.5 hours. So no matter how great we were possibly feeling about completing it on Legendary difficulty, we knew we had a lot more to do if we were going to even get remotely close to getting the achievements here. And this is where we essentially had to take what we learned along the way, running through the levels, getting more familiar with the levels as we played through them on Legendary, and mix and mash them with strategies that are already existing and strategies that speedrunners do, and also in some cases make up our own strategies if we were going to somehow get the under 3 hour achievement. And at this point it wasn't really looking too good. So essentially with each level we had to come up with our own unique strategy that implemented a lot of other things along the way to really try to save time here and there. And we ended up running these levels quite often. And just in case you're wondering, the footage you guys see on the screen might not always be our fastest time for each level, but the methods that we used, of course, are the same as the methods that got us our best time. We just weren't always recording every time we attempted a level. Jumping at the beginning again at Cairo Station, this was one we had to run multiple times early on to try to trim our time down as much as possible. The main strategies we used were at the beginning, we actually dropped past the first set of enemies and ran up the stairs as quickly as possible, just avoiding everything and hoping for the best that we managed to survive. And we actually found that in these open garden areas, if we jumped and walked across the end, we could avoid a lot of the enemies and get past a lot of this huge area without having to fight our way through, which did save us quite a bit of time. In the first hangar area, our initial plan was just to grenade spam and use noob combos while trying to pick off all the enemies as they come in. But actually, as we were optimizing our times, we realized if we took the risk and put on the Grunt Funeral skull along with a bunch of other skulls like the Boom skull, the Sputnik skull, also the Pinata skull was super helpful. We actually were able to come up with some newer strategies along the way to cut some corners speedrunners on our times. Now, if you're going to go ahead and run this, you want to make sure that all the skulls you're picking are still the scoring skulls, because a non-scoring skull like the bandana skull will disable you from getting any of the speedrunning achievements. But being able to quickly pick off grunts in that hangar room and them just exploding ended up being super useful for clearing out firefights very quickly. We just had to be extra careful with the fact that enemies could just blow up in our face and we would die, and sometimes that would be really detrimental for our run. After the first hangar room, you go into another hangar room, and this one was actually a little bit awkward. As it turns out, there is a strategy to clear this even faster that we didn't even know about, but we kind of just were extra careful to make sure we could kill all the enemies and looked out for that sword guy that shows up. We go into the tunnel section down below. It was kind of terrifying because the teleporter on the loading sequence is really weird, and it just takes the second player and moves them somewhere, and sometimes it could be right in front of the elite and you'll just die. But we were kind of prepared, and we started to memorize exactly how the elites could spawn or where they come from and how to quickly take them out. So we did get good at clearing this area, though it was one of those sections we were always nervous about whenever running this. In the second garden area, we kind of did the same thing as before, where we just jumped up over the top, taking out a couple of key enemies that would sometimes shoot us in the back and kill us. And it was nice being able to kind of just skip past this room and get to that area where Johnson and Keys already are. And we learned from other speedrunners that if we cleared this section quick enough and pushed to the end hallway, we could skip a wave of enemies, which is what we actually ended up doing here. Seriously, noob combos were so important and helpful on our Cairo Station run, and we are eternally grateful for using those noob combos along the way. So we actually used the noob combo again to hit the jetpack elites. Super helpful to coordinate with each other so we could just quickly pick them off and be aware of who's shooting at who and push into the bugger area. From there, we actually would throw a grenade right where the buggers fly up, which often killed a lot of them, and then we had to pick off the rest of them, which was kind of annoying but pretty easy. Then we kind of got to this section with the elites that have jetpacks and the turret guy. This is kind of the last challenging part before we would make our final sprint to the end, but essentially we had to land some pretty long-range plasma pistol shots to knock out those elites if we were going to try to push through fast. And if we missed our shot, we had to be ready to hit perfect BR headshots to quickly take down the shields and not completely run out of ammo at the same time. We also were aware where the next set of jetpack elites spawn in, so we would always try to quickly damage them as fast as possible, but otherwise we would make it inside, take the elevator to the final room, and since we have the pinata skull, we're typically doing pretty good on grenades, so we would grenade spam all of the elites. If they got close to us, we'd punch them, try to get more grenades, and quickly take them out without dying at the same time. This level had a lot going on, and while our first couple of runs were sitting well over 20 minutes, with enough practice, we were able to bring our time down to 15 minutes and 44 seconds, which while it still was over our 13-minute goal that we had set up, we were hoping that if we could save time on other levels, maybe having a couple extra minutes on Cairo Station wouldn't break our entire run. Going on to Outskirts, we played around with a lot of different strategies. We grenade jumped across the first area, then on the outside section, grenade jumped on top of the buildings and just skipped all of the enemies, running straight to the tunnel. It was really easy to do with Feather, Sputnik, and Boomskull on, and we actually were saving so much time flying from the spawn directly to the Zanzibar hotel that it seemed like it was a really good strategy. But the main problem we kept running into is that when we were in the tunnel section, having the Feather Skull on was actually really detrimental to our run. We actually had to deal with a lot of enemies that would shoot us and cause us to completely flip in our vehicles over and over again, and it was really hard to control the vehicle when you're getting shot at by just a couple of shots here and there. And while we were able to clear it in about 10 minutes or so, we felt like we could possibly save some time to make up for Cairo Station if we went the longer route at the beginning of the level, where we spent an extra minute going across the buildings to get down to the Hotel Zanzibar instead of just free launching across. Overall, you end up spending a little bit more time, but being able to drive without the Feather Skull on through the tunnel ended up being a bigger time save, which was worth it for us. And all in all, we managed to get Outskirts down to 6 minutes and 39 seconds, which was a time we were really proud of. We probably could have done it a little bit faster if we had hit everything perfectly, but you know, Luke and I, we can't do anything right. So 6:39 it was, but it was still under our 13-minute goal, and it even opened up some time so that if on harder levels like Regret or Gravemind need some extra time, maybe we can allot some time over there as well. Metropolis was next, and while we actually tried a completely different strategy learning it, we found that the fastest way is really just to drive right through the level, which was way different than what we had anticipated. And while it was really tricky navigating the Warthog through the tunnel, and this felt like it was the most RNG part of the entire thing, if we could have the RNG gods just work in our favor for a minute, we could typically just drive the Warthog Warthog right through everything, skip all the enemies in the tunnel, and make our way to the outside section. We would actually stop real quick before fighting the jackals or shooting at the jackals or making them aware of our existence, and Luke would go and sneak and grab a sniper, which we would use later on in the level, and then we would just floor it straight past all the jackal snipers, hoping they don't get a random shot on us. We'd make a really sharp 90-degree turn, avoiding all the ghosts and the wraiths, hoping that they don't kill us in the process, and if somehow we have enough health by the time we got past all of that, we would maybe, just maybe, have a checkpoint in the next loading section and we would have skipped that whole area. It definitely was challenging, and we actually managed to pull it off consistently enough where we felt like we could implement it into our run. But one of the biggest things that ended up taking up a lot of time was getting these other wraiths taken out as fast as possible. Eventually, the main strategy we came up with was I would go and hijack the wraiths right after Luke picked off those jackals with a sniper. I would quickly jump in the wraith, and then I would actually drive to the back street and go up into this little building area to keep my wraith somewhat safe and give me cover from the phantom, where I would then spam all of the ghosts and other wraiths in the area. And if we could do it fast enough and not die in the process, we actually were able to make a decent time going up to the scarab area. Now, we know there's this crazy skip you can do with a launch off of an antenna. It wasn't something we felt like we were capable of learning, so we decided to take on the level the regular-ish way, but we did find that there's a section on the scarab that you can actually see through, and if you can see through the wall, you can just shoot the enemies and kill them right away. The only problem is you have to go into the bottom floor of the scarab first to trigger the spawns of those enemies inside of the scarab that you have to kill to end the level. So what ended up becoming our strategy actually was Luke would get in position in the area where he could see through the wall, and I would jump on top of the scarab with a rocket launcher, hope for the best, take out any enemies on the top that were in my way, quickly run down the stairs to hit the trigger, and then run to the top and hope that I didn't die. It definitely wasn't the most consistent or reliable strategy, but this was something that would work here if we could do it correctly. This one took so much time to trim down. Our first couple of runs were up in the 23-24 minute range as we would do different things to try to trigger the enemies to spawn, and we try to do it in the safest way possible. But after really trying out different methods, and we just came to the conclusion we're going to have to rush it and take the risk of dying early on, we're able to bring it down to 12 minutes even on this one, which was pretty cool for a Metropolis run in the grand scheme of what we were getting originally. The Arbiter was one of the most frustrating levels because we learned all these strats that ended up not working, and while so many people suggest just go invisible, sneak past all the enemies, easy peasy, it never seemed to work out that way for us. We got spotted every time something would go wrong. It was a mess, and what we ended up doing was just going through the level as aggressively as possible, and we literally just killed every single enemy along the way, more or less, as we pushed forward. We actually found that just killing all of the enemies and not worrying about who's where and what spawns if you do what and kill certain enemies was a more easily learned task to memorize where all their locations were, rather than trying to memorize who and where and what you can and can't kill. And we actually ended up getting a really good time on the Arbiter with 8 minutes and 53 seconds. So it was cool. We just kind of breezed through everything, killing everything along the way. There was one section where you're running through this area on the way to the outside Banshee part where we did go invisible, and as long as we stayed close enough together and cut quickly and then quickly killed all these elites in the next room, we could survive that as well and kind of save a little bit of time there. But we're definitely okay with the time we got on the Arbiter. We decided to go ahead and skip the next chunk of levels and revisit them after we had times on the other levels so we knew what we were working with. So we actually quickly ran Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone before also skipping Gravemind to get a better idea of how much time we would have for the harder levels. Sacred Icon mostly worked out. The main thing that we had to do was, first of all, make sure that I memorized my route correctly, because I was going to be carrying the weight through most of the level, just running past everything, using my invisibility where I could, because two people running together, it's way easier to be spotted. But then in the final firefight section, there's so much flood that you have to kill for the level to actually end, and you have to go through several different waves, and this one was really tricky to get a fast time here. Eventually, we had a time that was somewhat okay. We had a 14:55, and we just decided to keep it and try to save time elsewhere, because this level was almost soul-crushing when you would get a decent time running through the whole thing just to have it completely killed at the end because of the RNG of where the flood ended up going. Quarantine Zone is actually a little bit easier and more fun to run. While we did try methods where we both just boosted our ghost through the level, what we ended up finding out was it was easier easier if I just memorized the route and just went for it and tried to get to the gondola as fast as possible. And for the most part, it was a pretty straightforward run. There wasn't anything too confusing. I just took my ghost everywhere with me. I did jump out at my ghost at one part when you're in this indoor section, just because it's annoying navigating it through these boxes, and there's literally another available ghost right around the corner. So I would just pop my invisibility, jump over there, grab the ghost, and drive on. And from there, we were able to get to the gondola. And while there are other places you can go to stay safe on the gondola, we found a really easy spot down in the lower area, just because it's easier to get into real quick. It works the same way as any other skip, and you kind of just have to sit there and wait for the whole gondola ride. Takes forever, but we were able to get a decent enough time on this level, and we actually cleared Quarantine Zone in just under 10 minutes with a 9:58. Skipping Gravemind and going on to Uprising once again. We already had a really good time with 2 minutes because I just used the Feather Skull to launch myself up into the air, but I actually found I could save more time if I had 4 full grenades with me, because then I could give myself some extra grenade boosts to get to this random spot up in the cliffs that randomly triggers the end of the level. So what we found out was with the Pinata Skull, I could punch Luke 4 times and get 4 sticky grenades with me, and from there I can actually bypass grabbing grenades from any of the enemies and go straight to doing the jumps. And then I just kind of bounced my way through it, and I kept running it over and over again to see what type of time I could get, and we ended up landing a 1 minute 25 second time on Uprising. Huge, because it not only freed up a lot of time for the other levels, but it also trimmed off some of our times that were a little bit closer to that 13-minute mark that were probably going to risk us not being able to get the sub 3 hours. Going into High Charity, this level is a little bit interesting because there is a lot of random stuff along the way that can be really frustrating to face with. One of the main things that was really useful was actually in this first area, quickly taking out all of the buggers as fast as possible, because we felt like those ended up being a really big detrimental part to us making it through the next area. Once we cleared all of those out, going through the hallways through the rest of the level is something you have to be really careful about, but once you start to memorize what type of enemies you can face along the way, you can kind of get a little bit better prepared for what's coming up. Definitely one of the biggest parts of this level, though, is making sure you get a rocket launcher from this specific flood guy that's just chilling right here, and make sure he also doesn't blow you up in the process, because this rocket launcher ends up saving you so much time in the one room that is really challenging. And while we were running this, we actually chose to run this with the Feather Skull on as well, and while it seems like a really odd choice, we opted for going for the Feather Skull because we felt like in that last area where there's all these enemies, being able to launch the enemies out of your way was more beneficial than the risk of being launched by something else. It was kind of an interesting idea, and it could have gone either way, but it ended up working out for us really well when we were making that run to the big door, and we were able to make our way into the next room that would be leading us to the elevator to the final area. In this final area, all you have to do is make it to the end of the room and just like jump into the little beam or whatever, and the level ends. But the weird thing is that there's a lot of RNG here, where sometimes the Covenant side of things, like the brutes, will spawn on the right side and the flood will spawn on the left, and other times it's reversed. It wasn't ever anything that ended up killing any of our runs, but we definitely found that the floodway was much easier, and for the most part we actually ended up trimming a lot of time off of High Charity, running it over and over again, and we got it down to 9 minutes 52 seconds. And while we did these levels out of order and we were feeling good about the times on these levels, we still had quite a few levels left, and at this point we only had about 1 hour and 40 minutes left to share across all of those levels. So we knew that the next important step would be getting that Gravemind time down, and then going from there to see how much time we can allocate for the rest of the levels. And mind you, Gravemind is quite the journey. It is so brutal if you're going for a time, because there's so much RNG in this level that you can't always predict what's going to happen. Though one thing that we experienced when playing through this level is that we didn't have this hate towards the level. Matter of fact, we actually enjoyed playing through the level Gravemind, which probably ended up helping us when we were practicing the level over and over again, because we weren't really getting as frustrated, and we noticed our time was getting really, really good every time we jumped onto Gravemind. The first time we got it under an hour, we were really excited, but we knew an hour still was way too much time, and we were going to have to trim it down even more. What we actually learned is that there's a very common strategy on Gravemind during the first firefight, where you actually can stand in a very specific spot in one of the grunt spawn hallways and do essentially a load skip, which allows you to bypass a few waves of enemies spawning in. We use this, and we think we maybe skipped about 2 waves of enemies. Sometimes we felt like we skipped 3, sometimes we felt like we only skipped 1, but either way, knowing we were skipping skipping a little bit here was very useful. And then from there, we typically would hang around the back corners, picking off the waves as they came in. The one most important thing that Luke and I had to get really good at was definitely communicating at where the enemies are and what we were dealing with. And another major thing that ended up helping us out significantly was once again revisiting the skulls on this level. We actually decided this time around to enable the So Angry skull, which makes it where brutes who are enraged end up exploding. It definitely sounds terrifying because we also had Boom and Sputnik on, and for the sake of this run, while a lot of people might disagree with this method, we chose to run it with Feather as well, and we actually think it paid off in the end. Sure, we had to be extra careful that these enemies didn't explode when they got close to us, but knowing that they enrage after you kill one of them, it almost allowed us to prepare for them to just start running around and explode. From there, we kind of just pushed up through the level, memorizing a lot of things. Like for instance, we actually coordinated a sticky grenade throw on these two honor guard brutes. It ended up saving us a lot of time later. And then while there is a skip to drop down to the next area faster, we actually chose to wait it out and kill all of the enemies in the room to grab a brute shot that would be really important later on. We pushed through the hallway section and it could get a little bit frustrating, and we really just had to memorize and be prepared for what was coming. But the biggest thing that really helped us on Gravemind was actually us memorizing the checkpoint locations along the way. Because if you push up and you miss a checkpoint and then die, getting put back to a couple checkpoints back can completely kill a run, where if you only get put back to maybe the beginning of the room, your run could still be alive and you could still get a decent time. Of course, we were nowhere near perfect going through Gravemind, but we definitely were coordinating to make sure we weren't shooting, we weren't running ahead, and we were going to where we thought the checkpoints would be at the same time to kind of up our chances of getting those checkpoints. And we felt like that actually made a pretty huge benefit at the end. Now, there is also one major trick that can save you quite a bit of time, but it is the prison skip in Gravemind. Essentially, there's a lot of different strategies for this, but if while you're going down the elevator, you have a brute melee you at the exact right moment as you go into the elevator, the brute will follow you in, and you can do a quick jump, punch, switch weapon combo and make the brute essentially go up the lift. And once you hit a certain part, the lift will actually reverse and you can skip the whole prison section and go on to the next part of the run. Now, oddly enough, I had no problem pulling this off the first couple of times we were learning Gravemind, but all of a sudden while we were running it, and if you were watching us stream it at twitch.tv/RocketSlothYT, make sure you guys are following us, you saw that we had one evening where for the life of me, I could not pull it off. And it's so frustrating trying to do a trick like this and not being able to pull it off when you're on a time limit to do it too. But after playing around with some of the skulls a bit, I actually found an alternative method for doing the prison skip that no one actually really talks about, or I haven't seen any guides on it, and maybe it's because it probably doesn't work in Lasso, so people don't use it as often. But for the under 3 hours achievement, it's fair game. Putting that feather skull on with those other skulls ends up giving you enough upward momentum if you shoot a brute shot at your legs to also bypass the elevator without even having to worry about having to get the brute to drop down with you in just the right way with just enough space, and we could fly right through that part. For the most part, it was way faster and way more consistent than me having to do it the other way with the brutes. And then from there, we were able to push on through the level and get to some of the outside stuff, and actually having Pinata and the feather skull on could be really helpful because we're able to throw the grenades at some of the enemies, and sometimes it would just launch off the side of the map, and that was way easier than having to fight our way through some of the waves of enemies. But we were getting good enough at memorizing routes along the way to speed up everything along the process. We eventually made it all the way to the part where the hunters come down, and actually our strategy was to try to launch them off with the feather skull and then just pick off the other one we could. And then when we got to the final section where everything's fighting and some Breaking Benjamin music is playing in the background, and we've heard the song for the 50th time on the checkpoint because we've done this level so many times, our main go-to strategy was I would go for this fuel rod gun and hope to not die while I was out there in the room. All the enemies would just take each other out. More brutes would come. Sometimes they would aggro, they would get angry, they would explode, they would kill some enemies in the process, and eventually we just had to clear out the little extra enemies here and there, and it actually wasn't that bad of a section for the speed run. But at the end of the level, the game decides just to throw everything at you and send a bunch of elites elites at the same time. But fortunately, after running this so many times, we knew the feather skull could really come in handy here, and I would just shoot the fuel rod gun into the middle of the group of elites a couple of times, and then I would quickly just run past them and hope that none of them saw me or shot at me or were right behind me, and make the run to the end of the level at the end. It was a crazy time learning this level and maneuvering through it, and after all of that, we managed to get our time on Gravemind all the way down from the hour 40 minutes we had to 35 minutes and 50 seconds. And we were really proud of even having a sub 40, but having 35 was kind of something else. This was kind of the turning point where we're like, okay, we can pull this off. We can get the times we need to make this run possible. Little did we know it wasn't going to get too much easier. Some of these levels are still really hard. Like for instance, the Oracle, which was one of the last levels we ended up doing, but was so frustrating to run. I don't know. I just think I don't like this level because there's so much backtracking from the previous level. There's so much waiting around in this level. And when you're waiting and you're on a speed run, it just feels like you're losing time when you have an overall timer you're thinking about. Essentially, you have to sit through something at the beginning of the level where this hologram comes up, and if you kill some grunts right away, the level might move on a little bit faster. Then you have to sit through this elevator ride, which can get really frustrating because these flood will drop down and one hit you if you're not paying attention, and I would lose focus a lot because I was getting so bored on the elevator. There was a short skip we're able to do to drop out of the elevator section a little bit early, which we pulled off, but we also died a lot of the times trying to learn it, which was really frustrating, but we were able to clear that. Then you go into this big open room and there's just a ton of flood, and heretic elites show up also, and you kind of just have to sit there and fight through waves and waves of enemies until finally the level lets you progress. But what was frustrating was we would die in this room sometimes, and we would go back to last checkpoint, and it just felt like this never-ending firefight. And sometimes this was the point where we decided our time was not good enough and we would have to reset again and do all this other stuff waiting to get to the part that we just wanted to practice and get good at. Still, nonetheless, once we got past that section, the rest of the run definitely becomes more interesting and more involved. It was just getting a good split at the beginning part of the Oracle that was frustrating. We had to be really careful in the outdoor area on foot because we have to make sure we're hitting our invisibility at the right time to avoid a bunch of elites. But once we were able to sneak past the stuff and get into that huge room and take out all of the enemies, a quick cutscene happens and we run up to the top of the stairs, popping our invisibility at right time to avoid enemies and quickly taking out the sentinels at the very top. Then we do this really easy glitch, surprisingly, and I definitely thought it was going to be way harder to do, but it's super easy, where we essentially launch me up in the elevator by having the elevator squish me until I clip through it. And for whatever reason, by doing this glitch, for the rest of the level, you actually have invincibility, and it was really nice to have. So while I was on the top, I just kind of hit those cables with a sword real quick, and Luke was floating in limbo while he waited. He can't walk or anything, or he could risk actually loading somewhere else or deloading something or just dying in the process. So he has to sit in this crazy spot where it looks like he's about to die at any given moment. But after I cut the cables, I wait a couple of seconds. The whole game actually freezes for a minute for whatever reason, and then I drop down to make sure I'm timing myself correctly with the loading sequence, and at that point Luke would spawn back in. Then there's this random RNG chance that while you're doing that, you'll have a different level of gravity. Sometimes we would have it where our gravity was almost non-existent and we felt like we were constantly ascending, but other times we had okay enough gravity, like we were rocking maybe like 10% gravity, but at least we were coming down from our jumps whenever we had to make jumps. There's all this backtracking through the level arbiter. The boss fight is a little bit weird also because we mostly just tried to spam him with our sword and just kill him as fast as possible, but he wasn't dying for whatever reason, or we didn't really know what was happening. People in our chat were telling us that we're supposed to wait for some dialogue, and even our boy Dim told us that we had to reset to last checkpoint because our boss had glitched or whatever. But what ended up happening is I just threw a sticky grenade at him and he like flew away. He said some line and then we stabbed him once and he died. So we almost got completely destroyed by listening to Dim's advice. I swear I have this crazy conspiracy theory that he didn't want us to beat his time on the Oracle, so he was trying to get us to mess up. Not really, we just thought it was funny to say that. But we did end up beating the Oracle. It's not the fastest time in the world. We had 17 minutes and 31 seconds, but we were okay enough with this time where we just didn't want to run this level anymore. Okay, the Great Journey was up next, and this one is very interesting. The strategy we ended up using was to do this skip very early on where Luke would jump in a ghost and drive around certain rocks, and for whatever reason, it messes with the loads and it makes it so the Wraith will randomly despawn. After he makes the Wraiths despawn, he can just go inside and teleport me from the beginning, and we would progress through the level with the hunters. Now, playing around with the skulls, we actually put the Swarm skull on, which makes hunters even stronger, which was super useful. And while this one sounds so dumb to put on the Feather skull and the Boom skull and the Sputnik skull with all of the brutes that have brute shots that literally would launch us, we found this method that ended up saving us quite a bit of time in the brute shot room when I was just joking around and I launched myself from one end of the room to the other, popped my invisibility on the other side, and snuck past all the enemies, and then triggered a load sequence that teleported Luke to me. We kind of pushed past the bridge really quickly. Where the buggers then come up, we would hit our invisibilities to travel past them. We freed up all the hunters that were in jail, which then help us clear out the area where there's this little mini firefight before pushing to the outside section. After the outside section, we'd run back into the building, go down the hallway, and trigger a quick deload, which actually for whatever reason makes all those Wraiths disappear, which was really nice. And then we'd waltz on back out there, grab a Banshee whenever they would actually land the Banshees both up there. For whatever reason, I always ran into the issue where my elite would drop the Banshee off and it would just fall to the bottom, and then I'd have to survive the dropping in the Banshee that way. Super annoying. But Luke would run ahead and clear a pathway for me where I would go and fly ahead through everything. The Spectres were still down there, so we had to be careful about them, but I would jump in my Spectre and begin my drive up through the water and up the cliff of this final area. I had to make my way all the way to the top of the building in my Spectre and essentially do a couple of really weird jumps in the Spectre to line it up in this really specific spot, and it was so frustrating how long it took to get this glitch to work out properly. It's so pinpoint specific, and sometimes there's RNG as to when the cutscene will load in, and we had it multiple times where we were getting a really good time and the cutscene would start playing early and it would completely kill our run because we would load into the next area without the Spectre. But eventually we had a good enough run where we made our way into the room with the Spectre. For whatever reason, we don't know what we did wrong last time, but we had Johnson actually respawn multiple times, and we ended up with a little military of 4 Sergeant Johnsons. And the main strategy we ended up going with was just to have the Johnsons shoot at Tartarus, and we would try to shoot at Tartarus when his shields were down to speed the process along and just hope for the best. But we honestly felt like it was better to just let the Johnsons slowly take out his health rather than us getting too close to Tartarus and risk us maybe dying at whatever point. So while we did bite the bullet on the time and maybe spent a minute longer than we needed to, we still got a 1747 on that. And since we were feeling like we had saved so much time on Gravemind, we were kind of willing to let a minute or two slide. So then we had just 2 levels left, Delta Halo and Regret. Now, Delta Halo, while we were really intimidated by it at the beginning because it's one of those levels that has so many different loading sequences, you have to hit exactly perfectly if you're going to complete the level by breaking out of the map. And we actually found that this level wasn't too hard to run to begin with. We actually cleared it decently after just a few tries, and we ended up with something like a 8-minute time on that level. So we were feeling okay with that, and we went on to one of the longest levels apparently in Halo 2, which was fun to learn while we were running this. But the level Regret is one of the biggest time drains when it comes to speedrunning for Halo 2. Besides all the gondola rides and all of the elevator rides, and then a boss fight that has so much RNG and random checkpoints and you can just randomly die, this one took a lot of trial and error to learn the best way to save time on this area. And even then, we spent so much time losing our runs at the end of the level because the boss fight would have just some random stuff go on and we would die and we would have a weird checkpoint and we just couldn't hit the stupid Prophet enough times for him to die and end the level. For whatever reason, we learned on legendary difficulty, you have to actually hijack him 5 times if you want him to die and the level to end. But we did come up with a strategy for this level that ended up saving quite a bit of time, and at least it was consistent, but it definitely was not traditional. Once again, we put our good old boys, the Feather Skull, Boom Skull, and Sputnik Skull. Essentially at the beginning, we would throw grenades at our feet and pop up through the ceiling and go right up onto the roof out outside. From there, we memorized actually where all the jackals could spawn. There's essentially 6 jackals across 7 different locations, and we quickly picked them off as fast as possible. This is the typical strategy, more or less, a lot of people go for. They have a different way for going up to the higher area, and they don't stand where we stand, but it definitely is the fastest way to clear out the jackals. What a lot of people don't do is they don't do a double player grenade launch across from the spawn room to the gondola, but that is exactly what we ended up going for. What we found is that if I throw a grenade at this one specific spot, Luke and I could actually use the momentum with the skulls on to launch across the courtyard and land on that gondola that departs early. And occasionally, sometimes we would hit it at just the right angle where those enemies would spawn and the gondola would automatically take off the second we landed on it. Now, if it didn't work that way, I would still have to go and manually trigger the gondola moving, but it still was really effective for just bypassing all of that. Now, for the rest of this level, there weren't a lot of tricks per se that we ended up using, but we did manage to practice and test things out a lot to memorize the ways that we would have to go throughout this level. We memorized the patterns in the underwater area to bypass most of the enemies while you're down there. We kind of knew which enemies to look out for and which ones we could just try to sneak past along the way. We did spend a lot of time after the second underwater elevator where we would try to grenade jump over this mountain to get to the last gondola, but as it turns out, you can just climb up this tree right here and do the whole thing without having to launch yourself, which was way more consistent. And then we would have another gondola ride, which was a little bit frustrating because these banshees come in and they just completely demolish you in just a few shots. But we eventually got good enough at hiding from the banshees until the end. And while there is a short skip you can do from jumping from the gondola to the main platform, we found it more reliable just to wait for the gondola to land and then take out the enemies and then trigger the cutscene rather than spawning in after the cutscene with a bunch of extra enemies shooting at you. When it came to regret, there was one thing we realized that we were kind of missing the mark on with the boss fight, and we felt like there was obviously something that we weren't doing right because we could not for the life of us survive taking on regret. So instead of camping all the way down at the end where you first typically hijack regret, we ended up staying right at the beginning of the room and kind of walked routes along the sides where I could get a good angle at regret, and Luke would try to cover me the best that he could whenever I was getting off of regret and I had to worry about an enemy randomly coming up and killing me. This strategy ended up being way more effective, or at least more consistent. There's still a lot of RNG that goes into this area, but for the most part it worked well for us. We were able to clear out regret as well, and while regret is still a very long level and it ended up taking us 24 minutes and 17 seconds, we felt like we got probably one of the best times we could get on regret with the playstyle that we have and just our own skill level. So we decided to go back to Delta Halo, which was one level we were feeling confident about and we were having fun playing on that level, to see if maybe we could come up with a brand new strategy to save us time. So Luke and I devised a plan where we would grenade jump from the very spawn, get up on the hill, and then split up. So the strategy was I would push up to the first loading checkpoint, which is where the jackals spawn over by the cliff, while Luke would push up on the right side over to where the main bridge is right away and start taking out some of the enemies there while I started making my way back over to where Luke was. If done correctly, Luke would trigger the bridge right around the time I would get there, and hopefully he would have also protected both of the ghosts in that area, though we only really needed one because there is an extra ghost a little bit further ahead in the level. And then we would split up from that section. So Luke would start heading over to where his spot is, and I would go through the lower section and actually go through the first temple area pretty much the way you normally would. I had to avoid some ghosts, boost past a bunch of stuff, but it wasn't actually too hard. At the end of the building there, I would actually hit the third loading point of the level. Luke would continue over to try to get in position at the fifth loading point, which still was quite a journey. It took him quite a bit of time to get over there, which kind of puts into context how long this loading point took. But typically, Luke would just be getting in place at his loading point by the time I was approaching the fourth loading point, which I actually would go over the hill of the temple and go back through the way that you typically would go through of the next temple to avoid all of the enemies. But we did run into one major problem. The second I hit that loading point, all of these enemies spawn and start shooting at me. And with this whole legendary thing that causes us both to die if one of us dies, this strategy could be scuffed if I couldn't manage to find a way to survive. And essentially, I had to get out of that area as fast as possible and find some place to hide in this area while Luke traveled from his loading section, which he would typically hit the moment I hit my loading section, and start making his way to the 6th loading section. It doesn't take long to get from the 5th to the 6th loading section, and the 6th loading section has a teleporter on it, but the problem was these enemies were constantly shooting at me, and we had to reset a couple of times because I kept getting shot at and there wasn't a lot I could do. Fortunately enough, Luke got really good at traveling from his 2 loading points and hitting the next one quick enough where right before I would die, I would be teleported to where Luke was, on top of a cliff of course, and we would fall down into the next section of the level. We were actually doing really good and on pace after a few practices of this level, and we only had a couple of things left to get through. There's jackal snipers on top of the building, which we would have to quickly pick off, and then there's a bunch of buggers that fly in. And if we don't kill all of the buggers, pretty much we're going to likely die or not have enough health to fight off the elite honor guards inside. Now, once we get past that and we got inside, I actually had picked up some extra rocket launcher ammo while I was driving up one of the hills, which I used to quickly blast the 2 elites right away. And if I didn't blow up Luke in the process, we could pick off those final elites. It definitely wasn't the most perfect strategy, but we actually were able to make it work. And we got a completion time on Delta Halo in just 5 minutes and 7 seconds, which was just the time that we needed to complete all of Halo 2 in under 3 hours, with the final time of 2 hours, 59 minutes, and 49 seconds. And my achievement popped in no time at all. For whatever reason, Luke's achievement still didn't pop, even though we played through all of the levels together. And Dim theorizes that he has to play through Halo 2 on solo difficulty because the way that the MCC loads those first 2 levels, and Luke just hasn't gotten around to doing that yet. So rest in peace, Luke's achievement.
Quick update though, I did play through Halo 2 on Legendary Solo with the Scarab Gun, and it finally popped.
But we completed the challenge, which was the most important thing of all of this, and it was really an interesting journey. We feel like we've gotten a lot better at Halo since doing this, and since we're starting to attempt doing a lasso on Halo 2 on our streams, yeah, for whatever reason, we decided that if we're gonna do a lasso, we're gonna start on the hardest one and get that one out of the way first, and then approach the other ones. That we at least feel like we are capable of approaching the idea of doing a lasso with the experience we learned from the legendary speedruns. It was definitely a journey. It was very, very challenging, way harder than we thought it would be, but it was kind of a fun journey nonetheless, and it was fun trying to trim down our times and feel like an actual speedrunner, at least for a little bit. But hey, after all of that, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe with notifications on for more videos just like this one, and you won't miss anything we upload, even if YouTube's acting all whack. Also, if you want to, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at Rocket Elijah, or you can follow Luke at Rocket Sloth Luke. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you all next time with a brand new video. Bye guys.